So that's very helpful, like that there are these 7 different categories of work or streams of work. Now, if there are streams of work, who's actually working towards them? What does that look like?
A lot of people need to come together, right, to really make this happen. Um, and I'll break it down maybe into a few roles, and then I'll give you examples, right, in each. So I think across the 7, there are there are operators, right? There are people who are actually like doing the work, right? Now this could be startups who are coming up with some very innovative, methods and products, right? Like which I spoke about a few examples, like making using agricultural waste to make a leather alternative, for
Right.
example, right? Or for example, finding a way to recycle batteries so that they can be used again and really making it circular. So there are startups who are innovating, and it's really cool the kind of innovation that you're seeing, right? There is so much that's happening, both globally and in India. Right? So like it's often called like climate tech now. That's the fancy word, but there's actually some pretty cool stuff that's happening there. Then there's a bunch of work that incumbents are doing. When I say incumbents, I mean like large industries, right? So large industries are also trying to like innovate their own processes. They're also partnering with some of the startups to pilot some of these things, right? So most of your large conglomerates are doing pilots in some of their factories to figure out how they can at least make parts of this, cleaner,
Right.
right? And this is across, right? So for example, there are people trying to figure out if you can use alternative bricks instead of the regular bricks that are made in a kiln. And there are people who are trying to make bricks from plastic, right? There are then builders who are ready to pilot some of these things in their buildings, right? Or for example, somebody is using plastic to make some tiles, flooring material, and then there are people who are ready to pilot them
Right.
in their factories, right? So in a lot of ways, there are people actually coming together, to try and make this happen. And those are the operators. Then in the operator space, you also have a bunch of non-profits, right? So especially maybe in conservation, etc. And coming up with innovative models, right? Or like how can you make this work? Because look, at the end of the day, you also need to find a way to make it sustainable,
Mm.
right? Uh, so there is this very interesting concept called PES, payment for ecological services, right? Where essentially we spoke about how, say, conserving forests is important, right? Why are forests getting deforested? Because there is, and we think it's very evil. Oh, this person went and like burned the forest, right? Yeah, but there are people burning the forest because they are trying to grow,
Crops for
crops there, and they need to grow crops because they're trying to earn a livelihood,
right.
right? So, the idea of payment for ecological services is, can you actually like make the local people a part of the solution, right? And so one way for it, for example, is to teach them restorative agricultural practices. So even in agriculture, you can have better agricultural practices which are better for the soil, which will help in which help in actually increasing soil carbon, right? Which need lesser fertilizer, which need lesser of this equipment, etc. Most of these practices sometimes end up reducing the yield a little bit. So, can I compensate for this yield loss? Okay, because the restorative practice is actually better for overall for
Overall, they are
yields,
better. Right.
right? But they are losing yield, so I need to compensate them for the yield loss. So, can I do that? And there are like some organizations trying to work in this space, but that's a model in which you're able to like maintain the livelihood of people and also do something that's helping you to conserve forests. And it's a very innovative model, right? It's called the payment for ecological services. You have to make some of these things viable, economically, for them to be sustainable in the long run, and you can do that with the right incentives and penalties,
Right.
right? You can
How do you mean? Like, give
yeah.
me some.
So, that's the other, and maybe that's I was coming to. So, we spoke about the players who are operating in it, which is the startups, some industry incumbents, and the non-profits, right? Then you have enablers who need to play in this space, and I think the biggest enabler is actually government and policy,
Right.
right? And they are the ones who can set your incentives in the right way,
Penalties to
and
be
yeah.
right.
So, for example, we all say that hey, we should not be using plastic, and it's so bad and all of that. But plastic is extremely cheap today, right? It's just extremely cheap. There's a company that's made an alternative to plastic, right? They are making a plastic-like material from seaweed.
Nice.
It's fully biodegradable. It's great. But today, the costs are not going to match. But if the government put a tax on plastic and and said that, hey, if now plastic is going to become expensive and become, say, more expensive than this alternative, then it would be viable to make the alternative, right? That's an example of how incentives can actually play out, right? Or, for example, today, no one repairs stuff anymore, right? We don't repair stuff because it is cheaper to buy new things than to actually get it repaired, right? But suppose you had something which gave you an incentive if you repaired. France did this last year. The French government is reimbursing people to get stuff repaired.
Right.
So if you go and get like clothes repaired or shoes repaired and you submit a receipt, they will reimburse you up to some 10 euros or 15 euros or something like that, right? So you can use incentives and penalties to encourage a certain kind of behavior and make certain businesses viable,
Right.
and therefore actually make sustainable green businesses more viable.
Make that more the default action.
And make that, and that's how they will grow, and that's how it becomes the default, right?
Nice.
So that's one player that matters, government and policy, and they have a very important role to play. The second thing that has a very important role to play, I think, is the financial ecosystem, because you need funding. At the end of the day, to do all of this, you need money, right? To run a business, you need capital. If you have an innovative technology, you need some capital to get it to a point where it will scale, right? And therefore, the funding part of it is very important. That some of it, by the way, you'll also have to subsidize. It's not just about businesses, right?
Right.
You will also have to subsidize some of these things because, and we spoke earlier about adaptation and resilience. All the solutions we spoke about, by the way, are only mitigation.
Right.
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 Everything I spoke about a solution is mitigation.
Okay.
Right. Adaptation also needs money, and the resilience also needs money, or mitigation also needs money. And some of this money will come from governments. So some of this money can come from the taxpayer, right? Some of this money will come from multilateral institutions. Like some of this money will come from the World Bank, right? But that's not going to be enough. You need private capital. You need money to come from private institutions. You also need some money to come from philanthropies. You need some philanthropic capital. Because at different stages, you need different kind of capital, right?
Help me understand that.
So maybe sometimes at a very early stage, right? You could have philanthropic capital, which basically gives them, which can be catalytic, which gives them leverage to just go to the next stage. So
I give you a 1 million.
I give you a 1 million grant to say, if you've done this research, please continue. Take it to like a stage where maybe you can
have a prototype.
Right? Then government capital, public capital can actually help in de-risking, right? So for example, there's a new project and maybe, it's not, we don't know the technology is viable or not. Private capital is too scared to come in, right? Because they are like, hey, I don't know if this will work. Infra projects are large, right? So they need a large sum of capital. So maybe government funds the first part of it, takes to a stage where you can prove viability, and then private capital can come in, right? Or government funds the pilot, proves viability, and then private capital can come in, right? So government capital can actually help in de-risking, and therefore then getting a large sum of private capital in.
And what would be private capital, just for everyone?
Yeah, so private capital can be, just money that comes in from banks, so loans that, say, banks give. Private capital can be, VC money, PE money. Private capital can be public markets. So that's I think that's the second,
Financing.
yeah. And then the last thing is, I think, advocacy and awareness, because that's also an important lever, right? See, these are all big changes that we need to make. They're not all changes everyone is going to make willingly, right? A lot of the incumbents don't want to make the change, right? Because it's not going to benefit them. It's going to put them at a disadvantage. And therefore, this does need advocacy. This is going to need, really building awareness amongst a lot of different stakeholders, right? It's going to need building awareness amongst people like, you and me, and people who are watching this podcast, right? And so that's the other role that, people need to play. And they kind of influence, right? So the advocacy and awareness actually can influence policy.
Right.
This also includes, for example, think tanks, right? Who do the research, who write papers which compel governments to take certain steps, right? It could include also like activists who, for example, file cases against the government sometimes. So very interesting case, by the way, this just happened yesterday. There is a group of Swiss grannies, right?
Okay.
They have their name in Swiss I can't pronounce, but it's literally called Senior Women in Switzerland for Climate Change. Okay?
Right.
They filed a case against the Swiss government saying you are not doing enough to address climate change.
Right.
Right, and then they filed it in the European Court of Human Rights. And people apparently said that you're going to die anyway. Like, why are you doing this? And this one, dashing Swiss granny is like, yeah, we might die anyway, but I don't want to die because the government did nothing about it. So, lovely. And just yesterday, the court ruled in their favor.
Excellent.
The court
Okay.
said that you have to do more, right? So, there's all of that. Then there's, of course, like activism, like, we all know Greta Thunberg. We know Greenpeace, of course. Another very popular group is Extinction Rebellion. They do a bunch of very visual protests.
Are they the ones who? There's also the whole climate protest with art, like where they go to museums, galleries.
Yeah.
It's a
yes.
What do you call visual protest?
Okay. Yeah. So Extinction does XR does a lot of them.
Okay.
So yeah, I think that's the other enabling piece, right? That really comes in. But yeah, I think overall these are the kind of players you would see.
So I think what you saw: setting policy, supporting efforts that are happening, and strengthening accountability for and direction.
And financing.